Hello, everybody. We're going to talk in this session about what to do in autumn to prepare our growing space. And it may be you have an allotment if you're lucky enough, or a big garden, or it may be that you just have containers and that's what you're growing in. But whatever it is, there are a few jobs that we can do to make sure that we're getting ready for the winter and planning for the new growing season to come. I hope that if you look at the picture that maybe you've been able to harvest lots, or maybe even more than it there too. So it's a good time now, and this picture shows some pumpkins growing, which you may or may not have, some cabbages, which have been planted much earlier in the year and are going to be for harvesting later into the winter because they're hardy, but also quite a lot of browning dead things, maybe still some beans up poles that have begun to slow down their production or even stopped. The weather is beginning to get cooler. It's getting cooler at night. So this is a time for us to look at what needs harvesting. The weeds still grow, unfortunately, until it gets really cold, and also what kind of plant debris, in other words, old leaves, old stalks, things like that are hanging about. So we've got to think about what we're doing there. So what we need to do initially anyway is to think about harvesting some things which are summer grown crops. So in other words, I'm talking about tomatoes, lettuces that are earlier in the year, beans, various things like that may be stopping ripening. And certainly if you're not getting enough sunshine and the temperature is dropping, you know that the tomatoes will not be ripening much more. And the same with other things on fruit trees as well. So what you can do when that's the case is you can bring them in and you can try and ripen them indoors, which they may do. You can put them in paper bags. Just check how you need to ripen things. I've got a quince tree, and the way to ripen is to make sure that they're on paper or they're wrapped up in paper. And anything you take and you're going to keep for ripening or storage, just make sure that there aren't any bruises on them or damage, because that can spread and they begin to rot, and then that spreads to the other ones. So if you're going to store fruit, just make sure that anything that isn't in completely good condition you can use as jam, or you can cook and freeze for later. Most fruits won't freeze immediately. So in other words, if you've got a lot of apples, if you freeze them just as raw apples, they will get very mushy and not nice. So the best thing with extra fruit is to cook it for a little bit, and then you can store it, and then you can use it again later. But of course, things like tomatoes, if they really don't ripen, and you could try putting them on a sunny windowsill, it may be that will help ripen them. But if they're not going to ripen, then there's lots of ways you can use green tomatoes. And there's a trellis YouTube session talking about making green tomato salsa verde. You can make green chutney. So there's lots of recipes out there that you can use, but try and use up everything you've got so that you're not just leaving it sort of hanging about on trees or on the ground. You can bring, if you've been growing herbs in containers, some herbs are hardy. Usually rosemary is, although I have lost some with very bad winters in Scotland. So if you can bring them, if they're in containers, either inside, if something like basil, something that is really just we consider to be an annual herb, you could bring inside. But things like rosemary, sage, things like that, you could just bring in where they're covered. So if you had a polytunnel, if you had a cold glass house or a shed or something like, as long as they get light, they do need light. So they can be outside. But what you can do with any herbs at this time of year, when really probably most of their growth has happened, unless you're still in a warm conditions and mild where you are, is cut back what's grown. not completely, but quite a lot. And then you can dry it or freeze it. If you chop up herbs, you can freeze them in little ice trays. And then that might encourage more new growth on the plants, the ones inside or the ones that you are perhaps sheltering. So that's for herbs. If you've got herbs outside actually planted in the ground, then just cut off the best growth you've got and dry it and keep it inside. Other things you can deal with are beans often are left. So if you are growing borlotti beans or haricot bears, things like that, if you haven't used them, you can leave them on the plant to dry if they're in a sunny spot. Or if you feel that now the weather is changing, you can put them in trays, big trays where they're not going to be too damp. That's the main thing. You don't want them to be damp. And they can be dried and you can use them later for cooking, boiling them well, or you can keep some for using to grow plants next year. So it's nice to have some that you've been successful. Another thing you need to do is just keep an eye on weeds, which I mentioned before, especially perennial weeds. Perennial weeds tend to have quite long tap roots, or they root well. And these are the weeds which grow from year to year. So dandelions, for example, are a perennial weed. And you know that if you just pull off the top, they will grow again from a tap root below. So it's a good idea now the soil is probably slightly damper, that you can pull them out, or with those ones with tap roots, dig down, get that out. Same with nettles, although some nettles and some other weeds are useful for wildlife over winter. Perhaps it's only a good idea to keep some nettles in an area out of the way and move the rest, because they will spread if you don't deal with them at some point. Don't put perennial weed roots on the compost, because they may well just grow there as well. So you can cut off the top of the perennial weeds and use the leaves, that's fine. Annual weeds you can remove and again put them on the compost, unless they've gone to seed and you don't want seeds in the compost. So it continues, weeds continue to be an issue really until the weather gets very, very cold, because they're very good at growing. Also, while you're clearing weeds out of the way, you want to clear any plant debris and compost it. So I'm talking about old cabbage stalks, cabbage leaves, things like that, which are just lying about. The reason you do it is because sometimes they can get pests or diseases on those things on the ground, and they will overwinter on the ground and then create a problem for next year. And also it's great for composting. It's good material. So have a good tidy up. I'm not talking about things like wildflowers, thistles, and so on, which you think might have good seed heads, which are useful for birds and insects. So it's only the sort of rotting vegetable and apples and fruit material that it's not a good idea to have lying about rotting really on the ground. So, okay, we've done that. So we have now, hopefully, some clear spaces in our veg plots or in our pots. And what can we grow now? Well, obviously, it's dependent on the part of Scotland you're in. If you're in somewhere which is very, very cold, then anything you want to try and grow through the winter, you will probably have to grow in a polytunnel or an unheated glass house, so it's protected. Other places which are milder, things can be grown outside, and I've experienced of that in Edinburgh myself. There's varieties of onion that go through the winter, garlic. These are all going to give you, you'll still won't get a harvest until the spring, summer, but it gets you that bit quicker than than growing these things in the spring, which obviously you can do and just not bother to plant now. But it's quite nice to do some things, and it's jobs that people can do together, fairly simple as well. You can grow winter salad leaves to an extent because they're quite hardy. Not really once the frosts come, but if you're lucky enough not to have any frost yet, hopefully, you could get things going, you could do that. Cabbages also, and broad beans. So there are lots of things that you can put in. When I say early autumn, I'm talking about September if you can, October, beginning of October. Some things a bit later, it varies, of course. Onion sets, and on an onion set, you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, are like little baby onions. And that means you're going to get a bigger onion from that quicker. You can grow from seed, of course, so it's a choice, and you can sow seed as well in the late summer, early autumn. But onion sets, which are obviously a little bit more expensive, you've already got a plant that's about to grow, or a bulb which is going to grow into a larger onion. So they could be planted outside if you've got incredibly well-drained soil and it's fairly mild in your area and open and sunny. But if you're in areas where it tends to be more damp or the soil is clay, and it definitely gets colder in the winter, then it's better to grow them in modules, as you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, where one onion set is put in each of those slots for the modules, and then they can be grown on, kept in, protected in a cold frame or an unheated glass house or a polytunnel until April, when they can then be put out. But you'll already have quite a good, you'll be advanced and you'll have plants that are already growing. Particularly good are the Japanese varieties for these winter growing onions. So Senshu Yellow is a good variety which is recommended. Garlic also is a great thing for planting at this time of year. So there are lots of different varieties. I've just mentioned a few: Carcassonne white, early white, Solent white, so you can see the names. And they also, as you can see from the picture on the right, can be planted either outside in the soil, which again I've done in Edinburgh in the autumn and it was fine, but I had a very well-drained soil and very open, sunny place. But if not, pop one into each of those small pots. And again, they can be kept in a protected area. You can plant them in bigger containers. So if you don't have an area of ground that you're going to plant into, they can be planted into bigger pots where you put a few of the garlic cloves. So you get a whole bulb, but you're going to plant the cloves themselves individually. And if you look at the trellis live demo on YouTube on winter planting rhubarb and garlic, you can see someone planting up pots and telling you how to do it as well. So that's a great thing to do and easy for people to do because it's not mucky. Each individual clove is nice and dry and easy to hold. I would suggest that you buy recommended varieties. You best not to buy it from a supermarket as you would if you're going to eat garlic, because some of those bulbs that you buy in a supermarket have been raised in Spain and places where it's warmer, so they're probably different varieties than the hardier varieties that we need in the north of this country. So great thing to do, and again, you'll be getting them earlier, or they'll be harvested earlier than they would be if you do it, unless you do it in the spring. But it's perfectly possible to do it in the spring if it's not something you can do now. What else? Well, there are cabbages which go through the winter, apart from the cabbages which you may already have planted, or Brussels sprouts, or generally brassicas, as we call all the sort of cabbage family. Now, you may have planted those a long time ago, much earlier in the year, and those are things which are going to be harvested this winter. But if you want to have cabbage which is going to be harvested in the spring, you could grow small plants, and Duncan F1 is a variety which is very good to go through the winter, but it really needs to be done quite quickly, so that you're putting out plants which outside, which will then go through the winter and produce nice young spring cabbage or spring greens if it's cropped really early. And as I said, Duncan's a good variety. If you can't do that, because the time is moving on now, you can always go to your garden centre and see what cabbages they might have as little plants. So they may still have them, but you need to move fairly quickly. Now we're moving towards the end of September to get the right ones. But that's a nice thing. And you could put it in pots, in a big pot. Doesn't have to be in the ground. So if you've got a good big pot, you could put, say, 3 in a big pot. And again, cold, wet areas, put it in a polytunnel, put it under protection, cold frame, and so on. So that's a nice thing to do, especially if you haven't actually got any spring cabbages or cabbages out at all now. Other things you can do, and again, they will probably fare better in the milder parts of Scotland, but I think it's always worth trying because things can be grown in polytunnels and so on, is some winter leaves. Pak choy, or bok choy as people call it, which is the picture on the left, the largish, roundish leaves with sort of a white stem, which you use for stir fries and so on. They quite good for growing as a winter crop. They need to go really as a plant, so you sow some in a small modules. And again, lamb's lettuce, which is the picture on the right, not particularly an inspiring looking lettuce, and it's not really a lettuce, it's just lots of these slightly roundish leaves, but it's your own homegrown greenery that you can put into a salad at a time when we're beginning to only have to buy salads in supermarkets. So that's lamb's lettuce is good as well. And again, if you don't have frost, they will go on growing well into the winter. Frost on the whole will probably do for them when they're outside. But if you can put a cloche over them, or you can grow them in a polytunnel or undercover, that's great. And again, a bit like the cabbages, you need to put a sort of fine mesh covering to stop pigeons helping themselves to what you've got. So that's the sort of greenery, some of the greenery that you can grow. Spinach is another thing. There are various other things as well. Broad beans. There's a variety of broad bean called aqua dulce, which is a hardy bean and can be grown through the winter so that you get your crop earlier in the summer than if you sow it in the spring. And you can grow it directly in the garden. Again, I've done it in Edinburgh, but it was mild. But if the soil is heavy, or again, you're in colder conditions, as you can see on the right-hand side, you can put one of the beans into a module and grow them under cover, and then plant them out in sort of April time, or when it's being the weather is more pleasant. You can, if you do grow them in modules and you get small plants, then put them out into something like a raised bed that you've got now here as well. And there is a trellis fact sheet that you can find on the trellis website, which is about broad beans and sowing them. It talks about sowing them in the spring, but the same thing will apply to do it in the autumn. And you could put them in a bigger container. Again, if you don't have much space, you could grow some in a really good big container and just slightly protect them from too much rain. The main problem about winter crops is that they can get too soggy if it's really continual rain. So that's, although they're hardy, they're only hardy because if they can be well drained and reasonably dry. So that's where the protection is quite important. But it's worth having a go. And aqua dulce isn't very tall. A lot of the information that you read about it says support them with strings and so on. I didn't find growing it was they got very tall, and I didn't need to give them support, even though I put the support in, and they were absolutely fine. And young broad beans are lovely, so they're worth growing. Right, what do we do if we don't really want to grow any crops and we haven't got things, or we've got too much space and we have some borders, beds that are empty of everything? You've taken out all of the summer growth. What will you do? If you leave it bare, the problem is that the winter rain and weather will sort of wear it down and form almost a cap. It can, especially if you have slightly sticky, silty, clayey soil. And what you want to do is to protect the soil from the winter weather. And one of the ways of doing that is you can put lots of compost on it. You can put a mulch on it, which again protects it. But if you haven't got enough mulch and you don't really want to use it for that, you want to keep your compost for the spring, what you can do is sow what's called a green manure. And this is sowing some crops of winter grasses, winter clovers, mustard, which will grow during the autumn into the winter. And before they flower, you cut them down and you can just dig it in or put it in the compost. So it's, in one way, it's protecting the surface of the soil, but it's also giving you greenery for composting. So it's a great way of doing it. And I'm always sad when I see completely tidied up allotments in the winter, completely bare with nothing there, because it's so easy to sow a green manure onto an area. And most garden centres or nurseries will sell you a pack, or you can get it online, of green manure. Just make sure that you pick autumn or winter mixtures, because there are ones that can be used in the spring or summer. There are different varieties. And try and do it while the soil is still warm. The soil will stay warmer than the ambient temperature. The temperature we're in can get colder. The soil takes a little longer to get colder. It doesn't really get colder until after Christmas. So if you try and sow the green manure in September, late September, early October time, you're going to get a better result. If you leave it too late, the seeds won't germinate, and that's a shame, isn't it? Waste money. But green manure is really something I think is a great thing to use for those bare patches in the gardens or wherever, or even in big pots. You can do it there. So we've talked a bit about vegetables. What do we do about our fruit in our gardens? We need to make sure that we collect any fallen fruit from the trees, because, as you know, they rot. So top fruit is what we call apples, pears, plums, anything that come from a tree, really. And some fallen fruit can be used. You just cut off the bruised parts. Or if they're really bad, you can put them on the compost and they'll just rot down, which is absolutely fine. Sometimes you see really overripe fruit still hanging onto the tree, and it's better to take that off because you can get overwintering diseases there. The other thing that is talked about as being a good idea is to rake any fallen leaves from around the tree in case they have overwintering diseases, which will stay, and then as the rain comes, it flicks the spores of overwintering diseases back onto the tree again. So if you clear up any fallen leaves and put them on the compost, then they're going to break down, unless you know there's some terrible disease, in which case burn it. So clearing that, clearing any fallen fruit, make sure you've got it. Again, you know, things can be ripened indoors if they're not ripe yet. Soft fruit is what we call bushes. So raspberries, gooseberries, currants, that sort of fruit is what we're talking about. So at this time of the year is the time to tidy up the bushes, prune them to a certain extent. You need to look and see whether this is the sort of 3Ds, we call it, and it's great for any pruning you're doing. So you remove dead, stems, branches, diseased branches that you can see, and any that are damaged, because any damage will allow in disease, especially over the winter when it's damper. So pruning would be a good idea to take those out if nothing else. But there are other things that you can be doing. For raspberries that have fruited in the summer, not autumn flowering, fruiting raspberries, but summer fruiting raspberries, you cut out what we call the old canes and the old stems, in other words. And if you look at the picture on the left, you will see that on raspberries, the old canes are brown. The new ones that have grown up tend to be a lighter color, a light green or a nice green color, and you can see they're new. So this is a good time to go in with your secateurs and cut them right down as they are in the picture, right down the bottom, the old canes out, and then you can tie in the new canes, the new green ones for next year, tie them into whatever support you're using, probably some wire support or against a fence. And that way, you're not going to get a jumble of stuff that's grown, because you can get lots and lots of different stems coming up. So that's for summer fruiting raspberries. Blackberries, same thing, cut them right down. In fact, actually with blackberries, you can cut them down completely if you want. So blackberries are so much more vigorous that you have to really control the amount of growth. And also you get thorns, which is not very nice for anybody. So you can tidy that up. And again, tie it into any support you have. Currants, red currants, black currants, white currants, whatever you have. Same really to a certain extent with gooseberries. You can reduce the branches that have buried by a third, so that you're keeping a more compact bush. Also, if you get crossing, so you've got the 3Ds, they're diseased and damaged, but you can also add crossing to that. And crossing is when you get two stems, branches, which are crossing each other, and then they'll rub against each other and damage each other. So you decide which one is a good one to cut out. It's usually said to open the center of bushes like that to allow the air to circulate is good for them and encourages new growth. Gooseberries often grow from a little leg. So in other words, you don't have any branches touching right down at the bottom. So if you have any new stems that are growing, you can cut those out as well. So cut them back by a third, currants, cut out dead, disease, damaged, crossing, open up the middle, and that'll be good for them to have that. If you haven't got any, think about having some in containers. If you haven't got lots of space, could be something you decide to do in the winter. Strawberries may have put out runners. Can you see the picture on the right? There are some little pots with small little strawberry plants, and then you can see little sort of lines coming between them and the main plant, and those are little runners, and that's how strawberries propagate themselves. They send out a runner, they grow a little plant. Now, some will have already rooted themselves in the ground, and some will just be lying, say, on a surface or down from a container. For the ones that haven't yet rooted, you can put some compost in those small pots as we have and push them down, let them root in those, and then you can sever the runner from the main plant. If they've already rooted themselves in the ground, you can sever the runner and just move the little plantlets to wherever is a good place to put them. It's also said that it's a good idea with strawberries not to keep them for longer than 4 years, 3 to 4 years, because of possibility of disease, and they're older plants. So, producing new ones is good, but don't propagate from really old plants, because you won't get such good quality. But it's a nice little job that you can do when the weather's good and you can be outside. And obviously you can just leave them outside. They're fine. They're hardy. So as I was saying before, maybe what you need to do now is also think about what to grow next year. How did you do this year? Did it go well? So you want to make a note of the things that really grew well and you got a lot of harvest from, and those that didn't, either working out why they didn't. Maybe you planted things in shade that should have been in sun, or maybe it just wasn't a good variety for your particular plot, container, whatever. And if you're growing in containers, it's a lot harder than people who are lucky enough to have space outside, because in a container, you've got to keep feeding and watering and so on. And it has been a long, hot summer for all of us. So review this year, crops. Perhaps make a note. It's a good idea to make notes in a diary or notes in a notebook about how it's gone, because you learn from your mistakes or achievements every year. So the winter, going autumn into winter, is a good time to think about what you might want to grow. It's also a great time if you're looking to buy fruit trees or fruit bushes, that you can buy what we call bare roots. And so the picture on the left is bare rooted fruit trees or bushes. Can't quite see what they are, but it doesn't matter. And basically what they're dug up. And so the winter is a dormant season. They've lost their leaves. They're not growing. So they're dug up and then just put in a bag to be sent to you, or in a container. They're not going to be grown in a pot, in a container. So they're always cheaper than waiting until the spring and buying things which are in containers. And there are lots of specialist nurseries who go in for selling fruit. And so this might be a way of experimenting with different sorts of fruit bushes or trees that you haven't grown before. So you can look through online or from the nursery catalogues what things they sell, and you can order them during the winter. And you can plant them in the winter. The only time you can't plant is if it's actually icy or pouring with rain, but mostly these plants, because they're dormant, can be planted out in the winter. The other thing, which is a nice activity to do with your group, is to look through seed catalogues, because it's great fun, and choose what things you might want to grow next year and what new varieties there are. There are lots of Scottish people, seed companies, as well as ones all over the rest of the country. If you look, and I've made a note of a book in the next page, then you get recommended varieties for Scotland. And north of England's fine as well, obviously, because they have the same sort of conditions we might have. But make sure that you're choosing varieties of seeds and varieties of plants that are going to be hardy in Scotland. And while you're at it, you could make a calendar of dates, so you remember that when you've been sent all your seed packets, to sow them at the right time, so you're ready to plant out the plants that you've produced from the seed. So you could make a calendar of dates so that you can put in exactly, looking at the information on your seeds, when to sow, when to plant out, so you're ready to do it. So what might help you in choosing how to grow and what to do? There's a book called Fruit and Vegetables for Scotland by Kenneth Cox and Caroline Beaton, which is a Bible for Scottish growers. Excellent book, so have that. There's something called the Scotland Grows magazine, which is an online magazine, which has lots of information, often about what you should do at this month or what you should do next month. So that's nice. And also Trellis. Trellis has lots of fact sheets and a YouTube channel with many different live sessions like this one, but many maybe you haven't watched, maybe something done 2 years ago, whatever. So it's always worth having a look and seeing whether there might be some helpful information there. So good luck with your plots or your containers, and keep growing.
Thanks, Caroline.